Hi, I'm Pam Colloff. I'm a reporter at ProPublica and a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine. Thank you for joining us in person and online for this Texas Tribune conversation with Roxanna Asgarian about her remarkable new book, We Were Once a Family, A Story of Love, Death, and Child Removal in America. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank our Texas Tribune members joining us in person and online today. We're grateful for your support. If you value events like this and you're not yet a member, please consider supporting the Tribune. Head to texastribune.org/donate. Some quick housekeeping notes. We will have about 45 minutes of conversation, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for audience questions. After that, Roxanna will be signing purchase copies of her books here in Studio 919. Please silence your cell phones, and if you'd like to tweet from this event, please use the hashtag #TTEvents. And now I'd like to introduce Roxanna. Roxanna Asgarian is the Dallas-based law and courts reporter for the Texas Tribune. Previously, she covered the child welfare and criminal justice systems as an independent reporter in Houston. A native of Las Vegas, Roxanna got her bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Texas at Austin and her master's degree from the Craig Newmark School of Journalism at the City University of New York. We Were Once a Family is her first book and is a deeply reported story of a murder-suicide that claimed the lives of 6 children, and it's a searing indictment of the American foster care system. We will get started. And as you can tell from that description, we're going to be talking about some difficult material today, so I just want everyone to be prepared for that. I'm going to start in the most obvious place, which is just asking you to tell us a little bit about how you got involved with this story, which I believe was on a breaking news assignment, which I bet you never thought would lead to a book. And I'm just wondering if you can take us through that a little bit and just give us a general overview of the story.
Sure. I'm really happy to be here, so thank you guys for coming. Let's see, so the crash happened in late March of 2018, and it was 2 women, a married couple. They drove off a cliff in California with their 6 Black adopted kids, and the kids came from 2 separate sibling groups. So my breaking news assignment was from the Oregonian, which is the Portland daily newspaper, and they asked me to door knock, basically, on one of the birth families that lived in Houston. So 3 of the kids grew up in Houston before they got removed. So when I did that breaking news assignment, I had already done some work on the child welfare system. So so when I knocked on the door, the family let me in. I felt like they really wanted to share. They had just found out. It was like 2 weeks later, and the way they found out was that their lawyer had seen like CNN and put 2 and 2 together and called and told them. So no official had called them, and they never did. And so it was really clear immediately that they were really grieving, and not just grieving this like terrible, tragic news that they were still processing, but they were grieving the loss of the kids that had happened a decade before. So, I did a couple breaking news assignments, and I was like, this is just I knew immediately that there was a lot more to it.
I first encountered this case through what I call the true crime industrial complex, and it had a very, very different take than what you ended up doing, a very different focus, I guess I should say. Can you just talk about what the prevailing narrative was as this story started to take shape, and then what you started to see as a very different focus?
Yeah, so initially, nobody knew who the birth families were. And so all of the reporting at the sort of breaking news level was focused on the women, and it started becoming clear that they had CPS investigations. They were currently living in Washington State at the time of their deaths. So they realized that CPS had tried to show up at their door just before they got in the car and drove to California. So, you know, as we found out who the birth families were, so I did a couple of those stories for the Oregonian, but then I saw some of these true crime stuff start coming out, and it was almost totally devoid of any analysis about the system, and also like any information at all about the birth families. So like there were a couple documentaries, there was a podcast, and as time went on and I was doing more and more reporting about, I found the second birth family, and that was 6 months later. And so by that time, when I found that second birth family, it was clear that they didn't know, and so I had to tell them. And so no one had called them. And I was like, my reporting was showing me all of this really terrible and like very important stuff, I felt. And then I was seeing a lot of the narrative just completely delete all of that. And that was really frustrating.
In the book you talk about, and I remember, I listened to the podcast, I watched part of the documentary, there was so much content around this, and the focus was on the two white mothers with a very sort of soft focus almost on them, that they must have been under all these pressures to have done this. And you did an incredible job in the book of calling it what it was. It was a premeditated murder of 6 children. And I think it must have been very unsettling, that disconnect between what sort of the national story is and then what you're seeing of the humanity of these families and these kids.
Yeah, it was, and it sort of was increasingly so as time went on, because at first I thought, well, people don't know yet, you know. But as I was reporting, I did a couple stories on each of the birth families, and things were, I mean, it started to be clear to me that it was more of an issue of maybe that people just didn't think that was the important part of the story, or the like sexy part of the story. You know, the narrative that they were overwhelmed was put forward by the investigators, like the police in the case, and I thought that that was really weird. The sheriff in Mendocino County, where the crash took place, he said that it could be two things. You know, it could be like a Thelma and Louise situation. He used those words, and I thought that was so awful, such an awful. You know, I felt that there was a clear race aspect in this case, and I felt that some of the reporting was basically doubling down on the same stuff that Jennifer Hart was doing, which was saying, you know, look at our great multicultural family and Black Lives Matter, and
she was telling a very particular story about why the children had been taken away from their families. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then how that, what the reality was?
Yeah, so this was interesting because Jennifer Hart was very vocal on social media. So there was a lot from her and almost nothing from anybody else in the family, the kids particularly. And her wife was also kind of in the background. But in these posts, she was very detailed about pretty private stuff around the kids' adoption. So like their first nights, she described it at length, like Marcus and Hannah and Abigail's first night with them, and a lot of really kind of private and potentially embarrassing details about how the kids were adjusting. And she had a narrative about the families, the birth families being like the Davis family. She said like Dante only knew cuss words when he was handling guns at 3 years old, and a bunch of stuff that there was no evidence for and wasn't in the case file. So it was very much a white savior type narrative that then when the media, when the crash happened, the media basically they were like critiquing it, but then also kind of doing the same thing by ignoring all the other aspects of the story.
I learned so much from this book about why children are removed from their homes, which I did not know before, I'm ashamed to say. I think when I began this book, I assumed that abuse was almost always something that was at least part of the reason why a child would be removed. And that was certainly the narrative that was put out there by the adoptive families. What was the reality about that?
Yeah, so both birth families lost the kids over neglect. The definitions are kind of weird because drug use can be considered abuse even though it's not. But there was no physical abuse of the kids in either family. And that tracks for most cases that CPS, most removals happen and cases are initiated for neglect, like the vast majority, so like 75%. And I think that the idea that kids are removed from their homes because they were being abused is like very widespread, because that's what we think that the system is supposed to do. So I think it just, these kids' stories actually tracks with basically more of the reality of the situation.
I, just in preparing for this, was reading about the sociologist Dorothy Roberts and her writing, and I just wanted to read something that I read in the course of this that was in New York Magazine. Sorry, I have Austin allergies. The odds of a black child being forcibly separated from their parents and placed in foster care before turning 18 is more than 1 in 10. I just have to pause on that because it's so shocking. Only 16% of children enter foster care because they were physically or sexually abused, Roberts writes. What the system calls neglect most often stems from poverty, living in dilapidated and overcrowded housing, missing school, wearing dirty clothes, going hungry, or being left at home alone. Now, not to minimize any of those things, but that's very different than physical or sexual abuse. Can you just tell us a little bit about what neglect may look like and what it looked like in these families where these children were very much wanted?
Yeah. So in the Davis family, the actual ultimate removal happened because they were living with their aunt at the time, and she wanted to adopt them. So she moved into a larger apartment. She lived in a public housing complex in Houston. She had a full-time job at a hospital, and she needed to keep her job badly because this was before actually Texas started giving kinship placements monthly payments. So they literally got I think she probably got a couple $1,000s one time. And again, she had to move. They had to get beds. A couple of the kids were in diapers. So money was really tight. And her normal childcare was her daughter, her grown daughter, and she wasn't available and she needed to go to work. So she asked the birth mom to watch the kids. And a caseworker happened to stop by unannounced and remove the kids immediately on the spot. And they never got the kids back after that because the mom had terminated her rights, so she wasn't technically allowed to be around the kids, which was a mistake that, their aunt lived with for the rest of her life. She really, she was like in between a rock and a hard place, and this, she was 5.5 months. So you need to have the kids for 6 months before you can adopt them. So they were at 5.5 months. So it was like 2 weeks shy of when she could petition to adopt, and yeah, she lost them for that reason.
And along those lines about parents signing parental rights away, again, this is something I was very ignorant on until reading the book. It sounds on its face unimaginable, but you explained that there are sort of, I don't know what the right word is here, benefits that are dangled in front of someone for doing that, where they might believe that their child would be placed with a family member, or more likely to be placed with a family member if they did that. What was the case with each of these parents with signing their rights away, and what the motivations were?
Yeah, it's in both cases, they basically thought something was going to happen when they, really CPS pushes for relinquishment so that they don't have to go through a trial because it costs money and it's, takes time and effort. And in the case of Sherry Davis, she, the kids were living with the aunt. And so the aunt said, yes, I want to adopt. And you can't adopt kids who have legal parents. So you must terminate in order to have an adoption go through. And Sherry wasn't going to be able to get her kids back because they had taken her case from the reunification track to the termination track anyway. And so she relinquished with the idea and basically was very much under the impression that she was doing that in order for the kids to be able to go with their aunt. That didn't happen. The thing that happens when parents terminate their rights that I don't think most parents actually understand is that when they terminate their rights, they're free for adoption by anyone, and they no longer have a say or are even allowed to know about where the kids end up.
And how did those kids end up in, I think, Minnesota? Do I have that right for the first? I mean, how do they go from they're with their aunt, then there's this violation of the agreement, and then they're in Minnesota with these two women?
Yeah, so there's a website. It's called the Texas Adoption Resource Exchange, and it's a bunch of pictures of kids that are available for adoption. And so Jennifer and Sarah, they were living in Minnesota at the time, and they had actually fostered a kid in Minnesota with the idea that, like, they wanted to foster to adopt. The foster that they initially had parents who had their rights, and so they weren't open to adopt. And they found the Davis kids on this website, and this was actually the second group of kids that were adopted. So Marcus and Hannah and Abigail, they also found through this. It's called TARE. And, the judges in Texas can okay adoptions out of state, and they often do it in cases where it's sibling groups because sibling groups are hard to to get adopted. And so I think that's what happened in the case of Jennifer and Sarah is that because they wanted sibling groups, they were sort of fast-tracked in that process.
When did it first become, when was the first abuse allegation from the Harts, from the mom? That was before the second sibling group was adopted by them.
Yeah.
Correct, okay.
Yeah, so the Davis kids were living in Minnesota as their trial run, and there was the first allegation of abuse made, and a teacher, one of the kids told their teacher that their moms were so they had bruises on their bodies, and the teachers also had noticed that the kids were really hungry and that they didn't feel like they were getting fed. But when they called home, one of the moms, Sarah, she said, she's just playing the food card. Just give her some water. So it was like the teachers in Minnesota saw a lot of red flags, but they realized that when they called home that the kids were being disciplined. That first allegation was not, there was no, it was not founded. So it was like, but in the same point, there were 3 kids that were up for adoption, and with the aunt, Priscilla, anything that happens in that 6 months can be a reason for the adoption not to go through. The adoption still went through, though. And actually, it went through in the midst of the aunt still appealing the decision because she filed to adopt. A judge denied it. She appealed it, and they were adopted by the Harts before the appeal even went through.
And With all these siblings, all 6 of them, they go from situations not ideal, I understand that, but to a household with severe abuse, with withholding of food, with physical punishment, and I think some things we can only imagine at, but it sounds like quite a horrible situation. But there was no, whenever CPS or other agencies would try to get involved, the Harts would talk their way out of this, or they kind of knew the language. They put on a good show, it sounds like.
Yeah. The language, it's exactly that. I felt like, and the other thing was that they would turn the problems back onto the kids. So it was the kids' trauma histories that gave them food issues, for instance. Or, you know, when there were outcries of abuse by the kids, that was made to seem like that was their trauma and their kind of damage or whatever. That was, you know, one of the caseworkers in Minnesota said, like, the problem was these women look normal. This is a quote. And they ascribe anything that we say, like, they ascribe it to the kids as their problem.
And it seems like in the social media posts, there was a lot of virtue signaling and just a lot of, it's interesting, the manipulation of language that they were so adept at. I want to get to some thoughts about policy and all that, and we'll get to that in a bit, but I was so fascinated with that reporting that you did on this and how you went about this. I just want to talk about, I mean, it's never easy to do a breaking news door knocking situation. You had to do so many of these very difficult moments through the reporting of these stories and then eventually the book. I'm wondering how you prepared yourself, if you were able to at any point along the way, if you want to talk about trauma-informed reporting and what that may or may not have looked like. I feel like a lot of what we do is sometimes winging it and trying to do the best we can, but how did you approach this initially, and how along the way did you either try to get support for yourself or try to talk to other people who had done this kind of reporting?
Yeah. So years before, I was a breaking news stringer at the New York Daily News. It was a freelance job, and they basically send you to whatever crime just happened, like in any of the boroughs. And so, you know, I had gotten over that initial, like, it's scary and it's hard, and, you know, no one likes, a lot of people tell you to get lost and that kind of thing. In this case, I was the only reporter who was talking to these families, and so I felt like they trusted me because of that, because I sought them out, and because, I mean, you know, like I told the second family, the Sherrick family, that the kids had been murdered, and that was, I mean, I don't think there's no class in J school that teaches you how to do that. There were times when, when that happened, I told Tammy. Tammy's the birth mom of Marcus and Hannah and Abigail, and she was suicidal when she heard. And so what I did was I just paused the reporting because she was in a mental health crisis, and I linked her up with a therapist because a therapist had actually reached out to me about the first set of stories that I did, and they do trauma therapy with birth moms, and so that was unusual, I would say, because I had this breaking story. I was the only person who knew, and at the time, they had found remains of one of the kids that they thought was Hannah, but they actually needed Tammy's DNA to make a positive identification. So it was kind of a breakthrough in the case. So so Tammy reached out, immediately gave her DNA, then they got the results, it was a confirmation, and they released a press release before they talked to Tammy on the phone. So there was a lot of, it was clear to see that they were being treated really terribly. And so I didn't want to be a person that was doing that to them or making it worse. So, I think my journalism background was prior to like actually doing trauma-informed reporting classes and stuff. So it was very much a self-led school of study. And I also I feel like I just was as sensitive as I possibly could be to them. And I also just realized that their lives were more important than my breaking news story. And as a result of that, I really earned their trust, and they were able to, I mean, they fully opened up to me, you know? So that was, I guess, a lesson for myself to, not rush, and it's not all about the story. There's a lot more going on, too.
And I think in that case, there were different places along the way where you had breaking news that you did not break in that moment. You had to make some of those decisions.
Yeah, with Tammy, I held that story for like 5 months, which is pretty crazy. But no one else got it yet. So I was like, I told her, like, at some point, someone's gonna find you. So let me know when that happens. And honestly, like, she needed to process what happened before she really could sit down and share. And so I ended up getting a story that was much deeper and better for waiting. And then now I have her trust, like, forever, you know.
What were some of the biggest questions you grappled with while doing this kind of reporting of, am I crossing a line here? Am I getting too involved? And even some more personal things like, can I handle being this enmeshed in this? What were some of those things you were wrestling with along the way?
That's a big part of it. I think, well, I mean, this whole story is just so tragic. And, this kind of reporting that you do, as you know, when you're writing something with this much depth, you really need to spend a lot of time and ask a lot of really personal questions, and they put a lot of trust in you. So I took that really seriously. It was still really, it was definitely very challenging for me emotionally to handle it. I went to therapy. I still go to therapy. I think that's really important because it's, there were places where I did do things that I maybe, that you're aren't in the straight and narrow of journalism.
Like, give me an example.
So the birth families really wanted they wanted their children's remains. And that was something that was legally not the case because they don't have the rights. So the next of kin was actually the parents of Jennifer and Sarah. They were estranged from their parents. So Jennifer and Sarah's parents didn't know each other. And they now have the ashes of all of these kids. And so I think it was really challenging for them. Also, their kids just did this really terrible thing, So there was a lot of guilt and a lot of shame. And so ultimately, I worked with Doug Hart, who's the dad of Jennifer, to get some of the kids' remains and take them back to the birth families.
I think that's one of the most remarkable, there's so many remarkable parts to this book, but that's one of the most remarkable parts is you driving out there, quite a long drive, and I'm sure the drive home was even longer.
Yeah.
But it seems to me like the kind of place where you do want to overstep those J school rules, whatever they, I'm not even sure what they would be in those. That instance.
Again, not really in the handbook.
Not something I remember being discussed.
Yeah.
But I think that's what gives the book this incredible immediacy and urgency. And it's just very, very powerful for that reason. I know that there has been the suggestion that because, and I hate to use the word cross those lines. I mean, if I'm doing a very difficult interview that involves something of this magnitude, I will cry, I will hug the people I'm talking to. It just seems odd to not be a human being. But I think the book has been so widely praised, and this hasn't been a criticism, but there have been a couple of people who've asked if this was advocacy journalism. And I don't think it is, but I wanted you to address that, how deep reporting is different than advocacy journalism.
Yeah, I have heard some people say this, and I think for me, it took me a long time to decide to do the ashes, for instance, and I considered that I could just say no because it was not really in my job description. I mean, but the thing is, it wasn't going to happen if I wasn't going to do it, because officials had basically abdicated their duty to these birth families in any way. And, I think multiple times it came up in my reporting where I was like, there was no roadmap for that. But I think that, deep reporting is just that. It's deep reporting, and you get to know people, and it's okay to be a human being, I ultimately felt that if I didn't do that would be me not being a good person, like, in my own eyes. So I don't know that, seeing injustice and writing about injustice doesn't make you an advocate. It just, I think that's what journalism is supposed to be.
Right. You also, in addition to finding the birth mothers, found Dante, and I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about who he is and how he fits into all of this, and was also forgotten by the system.
Yeah. So the Davis kids, that's Devonte, Jeremiah, and Sierra. They had an older brother, Dante, and when they lived with their aunt, all four of them lived with her. So Dante was 10 when he was finally removed from his aunt's house, and he was split from the other kids at that point. He was old enough to realize that he was being removed forever from his family, and he was having a really hard time with that. And he was acting out violently and just having behavioral issues. And so he got split from his siblings, and he ended up spending most of his childhood in foster care in Texas. Most of that in a residential treatment center, which is basically an institutional setting for kids with high behavioral needs. They're not great places for kids. The lawsuit against Texas for its foster care system is heavily focused on those places because a lot of abuse happens there. Dante himself was abused there by a staff member. His shoulder was dislocated in a restraint. So it's a kind of place where he also was there and missing his siblings and wanting very badly to be in contact with them. And so it really broke his heart to be split from them. I found him several months after the crash, and he was incarcerated at the time, which is common for people who have that lived experience in those treatment centers. And I was able to write a story about him and earn his trust, which took a really long time. And Dante was really the key to this whole thing from a reporting lens, because he shared his foster care file with me, which was 4,000 pages, and which detailed the removal of him and his siblings, and a lot more about his just extremely brutal and tragic childhood.
I think personally the hardest part of the book for me was realizing, you explain in the book that if you've been in the foster care system, that if you have children, that your children are more likely to themselves end up in the foster care system. And that's exactly what happened to Dante's children. And that intergenerational story just hit me very, very hard. So just one of the things you show is how many things go wrong here, how many lives were affected. And so I wanted to ask you just a little bit about policy, and I'm not expecting you to fix the foster care system or have all the answers, but since we are a block from the legislature and they're in session, knowing everything you know now, are there particular policies that you think should be in place, or do we need to think much bigger in a sort of paradigm shift away from this punitive model toward parents and more toward supporting families and extended families? Like, what would a better system look like in the broadest of terms?
Yeah, I think there's both good short-term and fairly specific things that we can do, and that the legislature has really been doing. Last session, they tightened the definition of neglect, so it would be less likely to be confused for things like poverty. You basically need to prove an immediate danger to a kid if you're going to remove them for neglect. So that reduced the number of removals of kids. So that's like a huge positive step. I think ultimately we need to remove a lot less kids than we currently do. Like you said before, it's not saying that these situations are ideal for kids when they're in situations of neglect. But the foster care system is extremely dangerous for kids. So we have to weigh that, It's not only they're more likely to experience abuse in the system, but also we're removing them not just from their families, but from their communities. And we're taking them from their schools where they're comfortable. We're basically taking away their tools to be resilient by isolating them. With Dante, he wasn't allowed to be in contact with his family, even though he was in Houston and they were in Houston. He got no Christmas presents at the institution where he was living. Like that, why would we do that to a kid and act like we're helping him? Like we didn't help him, we failed him. And so I think ultimately, there's a lot of things that we can do outside the system to support families. Childcare, healthcare, mental health and drug treatment that are divorced from the system of like, do this or else your kids get taken away from you forever.
And as far as the judiciary's role in this too, that was another just remarkable part of the book, Judge Patrick Shelton's role in all of this. I realize that's a really big story, but if you could just describe maybe a bird's eye view of what his role was here and how quickly he acted.
Yeah. So the first time I met the Davis family, so that was my very first initial reporting, they mentioned Judge Shelton by name. And that struck me as kind of odd. The case was a decade before that. So I was like, okay, I'm going to Google this guy. He's very famous. There's a lot of stuff. So he was a judge in Harris County. There's only 3 that do CPS cases in all of Harris County. And so there was a system that's been pretty well documented that was pay to play, essentially. So the thing is that attorneys who do these kind of cases, it's a pretty specialized area of the law. So there's not very many of them, and they basically serve at the whim, or at the time, they served at the whim of the judges who would appoint them. And so there were rumblings that you needed to contribute to the judges' campaigns in order to get appointments in the court. And also that if you were a problem attorney, you would stop getting appointed. And that would be like, you know, doing a very rigorous defense of your clients. That was considered unhelpful from the judge's point of view, because they were really focused on getting cases through the courts very quickly. But there was also accusations of racism, so particularly against birth families. And so, you know, it's reading into that was sort of when I was like, okay, this is very, I mean, there's a very systemic component to it, because Shelton and the other judges served for decades, you know, in Harris County, the most populous county in Texas, and had a hand in innumerable cases where families were split up forever.
I think what struck me about his court, too, is the very punitive nature of this. This was not, let's deliberate between these two different living scenarios and try to figure out what's best for the children. That, at least that didn't seem to be the tone of it. It was, throughout the whole book, there seems to be, at every turn, the birth families being not just not supported, but judged very harshly and just repeatedly punished and humiliated in a way that, again, I just had no sense of before reading this book.
Yeah, and I think what's so striking about this particular case is that you can see the disparate treatment because it's so very clear. The birth families were given, you know, I mean, when the aunt's appeal finally, it was denied again, and they said, why should she get another bite at the proverbial apple? Like, it was kind of like not only were they saying you can't have these kids that are in your family, but like they were just being mean about it on top of it. And then on the other side, there's Jennifer and Sarah getting investigated 3 times in 3 different states. You know, in the Oregon investigation, they found that the kids, 5 of the 6 kids were so small that they weren't even on the growth charts for their ages, not even on the charts. So that's like seriously indicative of malnutrition. And they said, well, we don't know their biological families, so maybe they're all just small. But they have they're from 2 different biological families, so.
I'm going to ask a slightly brighter question before we go to Q&A, not the brightest, but another reporting question. You did so much of this reporting during the pandemic, and I also reported a book during the pandemic, and it was very, very challenging. And I'm just wondering what that was like, if it changed your reporting at all, and if there were things you didn't get to see that you wanted to see, or maybe vice versa.
It definitely changed my reporting. Luckily, I had done a good amount of the reporting when the pandemic hit. But for instance, as you mentioned, Dante's son was removed by CPS, and I followed, and this happened while I was reporting on the family. So I knew his son, he was a few months older than my son. So because of the pandemic, it was very weird. Like, I was in the courthouse, and nobody else was in the courthouse, not even the judge. It was a Zoom hearing, but I had to be in person. So I was sitting in the court just totally by myself, looking at the screen, and everyone was on Zoom. So stuff like that was just like very bizarre, you know? It felt very, because typically those courtrooms are extremely bustling. And honestly, it was kind of good for reporting because I could see everyone's face. They were like talking directly at me. And normally it's like you can't hear and you're trying to, you know.
Harris County especially. Yeah.
I also did the Ashes trip during the pandemic, and that was, so I had my interview with Doug, Jen's dad, in his garage when we were both masked and we were like far away from each other. So there was definitely weird parts about it. The hardest part about doing it during the pandemic was I had my kid home with me full time. So there was a challenge in writing about this very extremely upsetting material and then also like full-time parenting at the same time.
It's amazing that you're able to produce this under any circumstances, much less those. I'd like to go to audience questions, and I think there's a lot here to dig into. So I'm hoping that y'all are not shy, and we'll come up and, yes, the mic is over here.
Hello. I haven't read the book yet, so I apologize if this is covered by it, but I'm really excited to read it. Could you help us understand more about why the initial reporting about the crash and about the Harts was so poorly framed, and how sort of state actors like the police who literally investigated it to people in the child welfare system and what they wrote in the reports facilitated that bad framing?
Yeah. I think the first thing is that the child welfare system is really hard to report on, so a lot of it is sealed and confidential. And so I think initially there wasn't, people didn't know and they didn't know how to find out. I think that was a big part of it initially. But I also feel like there's a huge stigma against people who are involved with CPS. And I think that many people just assume the worst about those parents. You know, I think in the podcast that they mentioned, Sherry Davis had a crack cocaine problem. And that was the one fact that we heard about Sherry. So I think that I also feel like there's some racism going on behind that, honestly. I think if the moms were, if those were their biological kids, I don't know that we would have experienced it the same way, that like bending over backwards about being overwhelmed. One of the cops was like, it was pressures, not necessarily negative pressures, just cumulative pressures. And it's like, do we need to do it? I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure ultimately how much of it is that people didn't care or that they didn't know maybe how to get the information or make the first step in that direction. But that's a good question. It kind of animated the whole project.
Yes.
I feel like I'm not going to be able to articulate my question very well because there's a lot to unpack. But I volunteer in the foster care system and have for about 5 years. And I'm on a break right now because I just got so frustrated and so depressed. And something that happened to me was I had a sibling group of 6 kids, and the oldest was in, and I had another volunteer on the case, but the oldest was in a residential treatment center, and it was during COVID. And you hear these egregious stories, but I would just encounter just really basic stuff that was just mind-blowing. I mean, putting her on, she was on 11 psychotropic medications. She gained 40 pounds in like 3 months. And me just saying, this isn't right. Like, I'm a little concerned. And the feedback that I got from the casework, from CPS, and the volunteer organization, and just other support was like, Katie, this is like one of the best residential treatment centers. It was pretty much like, you should be grateful that your kid's here. And that's just not good enough for me. And I went to write a letter and just kind of got sideways with the organization that I was working with, which is fine. I'm looking for another way to advocate for change. But my question to you, and I haven't read the book, I just bought it, I'm excited to read it, is in your reporting, were you able to interview some of the people that worked in the system that maybe don't any longer and admitted the shortcomings, or were they pretty closed off?
That's a good question. I also thank you for sharing your story, because I think I did a lot of reporting on the residential treatment centers, and they're really overall very
Horrible.
bad places to raise kids. And I think that there is a resistance to letting go of that model because we don't know where to put them, because kids with a lot of trauma are hard to deal with, and we sort of pathologize those kids. So like the 11 psychotropic meds, you know, Dante had a very similar experience. He was extremely over-medicated, and now he's at the point where he won't even go to the doctor. He doesn't trust doctors because of his time in a place like that. The question that you asked me was not that, though.
No. And I just have to add one thing, just because you mentioned that. I found that there are tiers of level of care, and it's all money driven.
Yeah.
And my kid was getting better, and we wanted to move her down a level.
But the money would go down too.
Yeah, they're incentivized to keep her at the highest level so that they make the most money.
Yeah,
You know?
and those kids at the high levels won't get adopted. They're just like, they know they won't get adopted.
No.
But we still terminate the rights to their parents.
Yeah.
And like, what situation at home would be worse than living in an institution where you can't contact any of your family and you get abused?
Yeah. But my question was, if you had any luck interviewing
Oh,
or
right.
speaking with some of the people in the system.
I got to interview the former director of the residential treatment center where Dante lived, which was kind of random. I wouldn't say they left because of feeling like, I mean, I think she gave me a very interesting window into like how they think about things. You know, I found that like the caseworker in the Sherrick family's case, I reached out to her, we spoke, and she said that, and she had like give a glowing review to the Hart women that basically allowed them to adopt a second set of kids. And she said, you know, they were so great, and I don't know if I really believe it, that it was on purpose. And I said, did you read have you done any reading about the case? And she said no. So it was like, I think there's, from what I saw, at least in this particular story, was sort of a lack of self-reflection because of what that might bring up in the personal sense.
Hi there. Thank you for your perspective. I have 4 adopted children, all from Houston, Harris County. My children were not adopted in Harris County with those 3 judges. My cases were all moved out of that district when it was time to adopt. And my children were all removed for not physical abuse. One of them was removed because his mom was homeless, and she had to sign her parental rights away in the hospital so that she did not go to jail, and she was told she would not be deported if she did that. One of my other daughters was removed from her biological mother because she was gay. I'm gay, and she ended up in my home. So it's a very weird system, right? I was a foster parent for 10 years and adopted, and although I feel very lucky and blessed to have adopted my children, I would not recommend this system to anyone. And I've always tried to do my best to paint my children's biological parents in a positive light to them and let them know that their parents love them, because I know they did. And so in writing this book and doing this investigation, what would you say to people who want to become foster parents because they want to do the right thing in a system that is so broken, especially in Texas? and especially in Harris County?
Yeah, I think that's a hard question, and I'm not a foster parent. You know, I don't, and that's the thing. I don't have lived experience in the foster care system, and I think there are people doing really important, positive things for kids, and particularly LGBTQ kids who really need affirming homes. I think that if, you know, with many people who get into fostering in order to adopt, there's basically an embedded kind of conflict of interest. And I think that people who get into fostering to be a temporary safe place can often be that, you know. But I also think I agree with you that there's a ton of bureaucracy and that it's sometimes things can, you know, I remember a woman who was in the foster care system. She aged out and she was with a foster family that she really connected with and bonded with. And then they changed their provider and she wasn't allowed to stay with them for that reason. And she ended up in a residential treatment center as well and experienced really horrific abuse. So it's hard to say, like, go do this thing, but I do think that there are really people in the system who are trying really hard, even against all these odds. I wouldn't do it. You wouldn't?
I wouldn't do it all over again. I would not recommend it to anyone I know. It was 10 years, and I have my children. They're great. I have fantastic children. But there is nothing, everything that you described about the judges, about the system, about the city, I was feeling that because I lived it as a foster parent.
Yeah.
And even though I was on the side of this side of things, I saw the ugliness. And I would not be able to do it, to say to anyone, go be a foster parent, because you're going to help. Because, are you?
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. That was really thought-provoking. We have time for one more. I'm sorry. Yes. Sewell, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. If you commit crimes in different states, I believe that's reported into the FBI, database, and yet it seems here there were parents who had opened child welfare or investigations in several states. How is it that that information isn't shareable? How is it that they were basically allowed to leave state after state where there had been concerns about their parenting? I mean, that part of the book just really, all of it is outrageous. But I thought that the inability of the child welfare systems in the different states to kind of communicate just was really disturbing, and I'd love any additional context you have on that.
Yeah. All the child welfare system is this patchwork systems, state and county level systems. There's no national database or something. I am a little, hesitant because we've seen how these national databases can be used against poor Black people. But I do think that it was striking that when Oregon initiated their case, they actually reached out to the Minnesota caseworkers. And the Minnesota caseworkers gave a pretty, Oregon shared this investigation too, which is rare. So it was really interesting to get that insight. But the Minnesota caseworkers seemed to really recognize that there was a problem, and it really does beg the question because they did communicate, and they said, and they made it clear these women look normal, right? And they ascribed these behaviors to the kids, and they basically had as much proof as you could get, right? In terms of these kids are very, very small. They're way too small. One of the kids had no two front teeth and like died that way as like a teenager. So there was, you know, it really is sort of unfathomable. I think there's a lot of bureaucracy, like the caseworker has to go to their supervisor, and there has to be, I think there might have been a question of like, well, what do we do with them? Like if we take them from their adoptive home, where do they go? Do they go back? Do they go to the Minnesota foster care system or the Oregon foster care system? I think, honestly, that might have had something to do with it. It's not in the documents or anything, but it does beg the question because it seems pretty clear that that people knew, multiple people knew, that the kids weren't okay.
I'm just going to ask one last thing, and then I promise we'll wrap this up. I'm trying to find a ray of hope here somewhere. So who is there a model, even if it's abroad, or like who is doing the best version of this out there? Is there something?
That's a good question. I don't know that much about the system outside of the US, and I know that there are big differences in other places. I know that, like, I have a source of mine who, his organization's called Family Finders, and essentially their model is we search for people who are related or fictive kin, meaning like, this is my neighbor that I grew up next door to. They know the kid, they love the kid, those people. Because there's all these kids who are sort of stuck in the system in limbo because their parental rights are terminated, but they don't have anywhere to go. So finding like actual people who know that kid to take them on. You know, the other thing is that there's a movement to not terminate rights, not terminate parental rights unless you have a family willing and able to take the kid, so that kids are never legally without parents, you know, with living parents, because we essentially make these kids legal orphans, and they're not, you know, they do still have people who, and, you know, I didn't mention this earlier, but Dante, at age 16, actually ended up back with his father figure, Nathaniel. He walked 6 miles because he recognized the neighborhood to his old apartment and found Nathaniel. And the foster parent that he was with at that time was really supportive of reunification, and they ended up giving him custody. And it you know, it begs the question of why, after years of, you know, abusive institutional living, is Nathaniel a fit parent, but he wasn't when he wanted Dante at 10 years old before all of this.
Thank you so much. It's such an incredible, incredible book. I want to also thank the Texas Tribune members who turned out today. And once again, a reminder that Tribune supporters keep events like this free and accessible for all. The Tribune is a nonprofit news organization, and we rely on support from folks like you. If you value our events and our journalism, join as a member at texastribune.org/donate. Thank you, everybody, and please go buy books.
Thank you, Pam.